to introduce myself and time myself. Thank you for reconciling the idea of islands with ecosystemic thinking. So I'm going to present, it's going to be a simple presentation. I'm going to, and also want to welcome some of our students from GSD that are joining us from Cambridge. I'm going to present what I think are some influence, at least influences for me, and the reason for present this work is because on the one hand I think this is one of the hardest aspects to trace in the practices like mine that have been interested in landscape, but also because it's actually a work in progress, the act of tracing these influences. And then I'm going to explain briefly some projects that have close proximity to these influences, but that were also competitions that were not originally meant to be landscapes. So I'm going to start with this image that it's, actually I couldn't find a better image. I took this photograph in Sao Paulo some years ago when I visited and I discovered the work of Sergio Bernardes, which is an architect that I think was born in 1909, contemporary of Oscar Niemeyer, and who is, I think, one of the designers that I think we should be really looking at when we try to retrace this history of ecological thinking, but also territorial design. This is, as you see, a project in a single image. This is the whole country of Brazil. These are a series of cities with distances of 400 kilometers in between them. And each one defines an aqueduct. And he basically proposed this idea as part of a laboratory that he called the Laboratory for Conceptual Investigations in Brazil at that time, in which he was basically speculating about cities, about an architecture, but also about the difficulties and the complexities of literally colonizing a country so large. So this project was also basically an alternative to of course, the centralized model of Brasilia. Sergio Bernardes, again, this project has been extremely influential for me, for many projects. You see the balloon, but also you see a garden by Roberto Burle Marx. So this is for the 1958 exhibition in Belgium. So this, of course, predates the work of Koolhaas. I wouldn't be so surprised if he already knew about this. It was a project in which this balloon was meant to be not only a beacon for the pavilion, but also a way to basically transform that space into a courtyard and design in coordination with this tropical garden that was exported and designed by Roberto Burle Marx. So it's a building. It's about this contained garden, but also about this floating structure. The way to draw has also been quite influential. This is some more images of the pavilion. So again, this is a very particular mind that somehow, and I'm looking forward to have this conversation in Brazil, has been somehow forgotten. Many people do not know it. It's a bit difficult to find information in English and Spanish about his work. And in part, and this is something that I think we should really think about, is work that was happening at the same time that the country, particularly Brazil, was urbanizing fast, and work that had a certain side of speculation was somehow not as visible, of course, as the work of contemporaries like, of course, Oscar Niemeyer and all these other figures like Lucio Costa, for example, in Rio de Janeiro. So I think it's fair to say that this was happening when Rio de Janeiro was literally was the center of the world in terms of arts and design. But also this image that could be, this is one of the houses he designed. He designed many houses in Brazil, in which even the heights of certain sections were not so much influenced by of course, influenced by tropical modernism, but also had direct connections with certain geographic events that were actually quite distant. So it's an interesting spin on the tropical modernity, and I think it's quite important for look at it. Or even in projects that you wouldn't think as projects about openness or porosity, like a vertical tower, like this speculative project for Casa Alta in Brazil. Moving to arts, I think what Camilo showed was really interesting, but I think also certain things have happened in Colombian art that has been quite influential for us, certainly for me. This is by Rodrigo Callejas, my father. This is 1972. Super Studios Continuous Monument was 1969, I think. So this is 3 years of separation. A Colombian artist, he was not the only one, probably looking at the same people, so maybe the same reference. By no means, I'm not trying to say that he predated Super Studio, but maybe, I don't know. In any case, this was a moment in which Colombian art was clearly connected with a network that was quite global. Or this sculpture, also part of his work, also from that time, that is basically an abstraction of the mountains and the representation of the atmosphere and the air as neon. Work by Silvia Mujica. This is, of course, I'm allowing myself to also be a bit autobiographical because Latins were very good at that, but also because it's just necessary in this case where it's difficult to trace the influence. Painting by Silvia Mujica, my mother, that was obsessed for almost 30 years into representing the plants without showing any kind of context, no sky, no context, and focusing on how the light could be a manifestation of the weather outside. So basically, what I remember more clearly, that was also the part that was more influential, is the plant as individual and the painting about the plant, not being about the individual really, but actually the context around it and how it could be able to reflect from pure white to certain types of green. So basically an obsession particularly with palms. The work of Grupo Utopia that I want to acknowledge, but also because we really try to have them here, but they are in Paris. An extremely influential work, I think, at least for many of us, because not only deal with questions about the city and urbanism, but also a hybrid practice that somehow at intersections between art and architecture. But also work that was clearly, that you could clearly connect to that lineage of Super Studio and with not too much time difference. This is work that it's also extremely difficult to track. There was a really interesting exhibition a couple of years ago, but I think we should really start to pay more attention to that work. This is more of the work of Grupo Utopia, always questions about the city, about the speculation, and through the lens of art. My own work dealing with photography, I got to landscape through representation. I think representation and landscape are inseparable, really. In my case, not through painting, but through photography, and to starting to hunt certain landscape that for me could be ways to basically be able to decontextualize certain conditions to photography, to use in drawings, but also to use certain formal strategies. And as that, for example, that it's the past one, a dam in Iceland, the second largest dam in Europe, or one of the ocean pools in Australia. This is the one called the icebergs. Anonymous architecture. A seawall in Japan. So basically, this series of photographs that I've been collecting not only end up in the drawings, that I would say is 50% of those photographs, but in many cases, those really large-scale objects and geometries end up finding their way in becoming the actual projects. So it's a very direct translation from the act of traveling to collecting those landscapes and literally using those elements at multiple scales. So from that seawall in Japan, in the island of Naoshima, to the simple boardwalk in Iceland. Always with a lot of attention to the context and the atmosphere of those settings. The translations of those photographs, at least for me, and this is probably one of the reasons I jumped into landscape, has been instinctively from the beginning through the plan as projection. So the plan as a projection that allows you to jump through scales and basically these are hand drawings or 48 competitions that I've done since 2008. And I'm going to start with, it's a project that I've never shown in a lecture. I don't know how this is going to go. It's actually the first project that I ever did. This is when I started to work with Edgar Mazo and Sebastián Mejía as part of Paisajes Emergentes. And this is before the competition of the pools. We got this really strange commission of the theater festival in Bogota commissioned us to design a stage for puppets in what is a really huge parking lot in Corferias. It's an event venue in Bogota, one of the largest in Colombia. So this is a parking lot. This is a 10-meter grid. And we had something like 1.5 million pesos, so less than $1,000 to basically affect that site. But we also found quite difficult to work in a place that was completely enclosed when we started, and we wanted to have an office to deal with questions of landscape. So it was really, but also it's the project that we started to think, how could we introduce ideas about landscape, in this case, in the extreme containment of a parking lot. So many of you here are familiar with this plastic material that is used for the flower cultives that you see around the city everywhere. We use that plastic as a way to replicate basically a foggy day, like the ones that we are having now in Medellin that are quite strange. So, and basically that as a setting, it was basically the decontextualization of certain photographs that we did in the coast of Colombia, where in very foggy coast, as a way to create a backdrop for those puppets. Using simply the forest of columns of the parking lot. This is moving now to the aquatic center in Medellin. This is a project that many of you know. I'm going to try to show you some of the other influence, or let's say not so obvious influences of that project. As you know, we were three partners, Edgar Mazo, Sebastián Mejía, and myself. And I was really interested in this. This is this incredible network of ocean pools in Australia, in Sydney. There are more than this. It's 20-something ocean pools. And while I was looking at the geometry and the setting of these pools, mostly designed by engineers, some quite precarious, some others defined with concrete, Edgar particularly and Sebastián were looking into architecture that more or less resembled that. So I think in that productive conversation, some ideas about geometry and landscape became quite important. So in short, we were looking at the same time as CISA pools, which are of course a masterpiece of landscape integration, not landscape architecture, and the pools in Australia, basically the anonymous pieces of public infrastructure. So I do believe that if this gave us some of the, let's say, architectural language for the project as a precedent, the pools in Australia, at least for me, gave me a clue about the geometric variations of some of the walls. And this is really what we always thought that we wanted in Medellin, a city 400 kilometers from the sea. So in a way, our job was a lot more complicated than CISA's job. The landscape is there already, and it's about landscape integration. In our case, what about the reconstruction of an ocean 400 kilometers from the sea? So it's a big problem. The brief was quite strange. Some of you probably did that competition and remember that the brief smelled as if it was based on the Beijing Aquatic Center, probably because it was very close to those games. So it was a brief that probably wanted a contained environment and a building for pools, as they usually are. But Medellin, as you know, and it's a city in the middle of the Andes, with a constant temperature, where you don't really need a building to contain a professional swimming facility. So usually open-air swimming facilities are for recreation, while the covered ones are the professionals. We really wanted to push the idea that in a city like Medellin, the tropical belt, you will be able to have a scenario for swimming that could be used professionally, still getting rid of the walls and the roof. This is the valley, and this is probably interesting also for some of my students that are here, just to understand that flatness is an exception and not a rule, which makes the horizontality of an operation like that more special. And other issues, like simply it rains a lot in Medellin. Well, not these days, but it usually rains a lot. So maybe the proximity to the ocean could be manifested, or that connection could be, even if it was just heuristic with the cycles of rain and the selection of certain plants. But first, it started with those collages and those photographs, and it was really about a fiction. It was really about swimming in water surrounded by more water. And in a way, it was an impossible project that managed to seduce the jury into thinking that this could be a park-like professional swimming facility. And the indeterminacy of those pools was yet to be defined, but that had the potential to be a landscape. But it was necessary to communicate it with that level of abstraction in a context in which landscape was still, I think, as a conversation, still nascent. So that's what I really like Brigitte's comment about no context, because the work has been, in that case, I remember, criticized for that. And questions about what are those pools and the mosquitoes and all that were there. But at the same time, we were always struggling in finding an alternative, which, of course, had to happen in coordination with a lot of people that help us, among them biologists and plant designers. Andres Ospina worked with us in this project. But whatever these gardens will be, the system was going to be the same, which is a system of pool, courtyard, and the garden always surrounding the geometries of the pools and the geometries of the courtyards. So that was for us the landscape that we really, and I call it landscape because different than CISA, we really had to create it from scratch. For CISA, the landscape was there already. Drawings attempting to, you can see the level of naiveness in the drawing as we didn't know exactly what we were planting at that time. And we were finding it along the way during the design of the process. But because that was so undetermined, that pushed us to have a very rigid and quite deterministic geometry that will be able to contain either water or plants or grasses. They will be able to be overgrown or simply completely die, as they are dead today because it's not raining. We went today, and I told Charles and Helen when we went that the gardens are at their worst right now. So it's interesting because these gardens then become simply a mirror of what's happening. This is on a normal Medellin day when we have around 100 days of rain a year. So when they are grown like that, they act as rooms, so they block some of the views, and this street, as some of you know, is meant to, in the case of a good administration, is meant to be open, so somehow replace the sidewalk outside. And then these excavations will be able to give some degree of privacy and intimacy to competitors that don't necessarily want to be in a park-like situation. And the operation, basically, of the excavation allowed us to have some degree of building-like condition in a project that wasn't really asking for it in the first place. The only building that emerges from that datum is the stands. The only one that we considered was worth keeping as a kind of vertical extrusion to be able to watch really the only sport that we think had a decent audience, the synchronized swimming, also because it's simply quite beautiful as a dance. So more than a sport, we saw it as a landscape as well. And the constraints of the site were incredibly tough. I forgot to say Sebastian worked in this project. You worked really hard on this. It was complicated. So as you know, these are the old pools. This is a project that needed renovations. The administration decided to keep the two sets of stands. So geometrically, we had a complicated condition that somehow wasn't too flexible, simply because you cannot change the geometry of the pools. The pools are pools, they are squares, and the garden somehow had to deal with that. So that geometry that is seemingly a bit overcomplicated was actually a way to negotiate the geometry of the rectangles and the squares and the odd shape of the site that we were given. The excavations were meant always to, and this my former partner Edgar was obsessed with that, with this idea that the walls could become almost like vertical extensions of these gardens. And if left unkept, some of the moss will invade those cracks. And so all the detailing was basically meant to intensify that. I always like to think that the detailing is quite raw, and that the only details that we really have are to incentivize some kind of landscape condition. I'm going to move fast. I'm going to skip this one that Charles showed. So it's basically the master plan for the Olympics. And I'm going to switch to a project that I did, was the first project once when I started the new practice and when I was looking into other mediums for landscape, in this case, water and air. I was interested in the manifestation of air and as water, and looking at these experiments by Humboldt that were basically experiments about trying to determine whether the air is water and how much humidity there is in the air, and developing this very basic tool, the cyanometer. And this was connected with a competition that happened in Montreal. This is a city in Canada. Some of you know it's a city that eats water. It's quite snowy. It's an island also. And there was a competition, very strange, to connect the airport with the city center and to design some kind of landscape without the budget of a landscape, so it was meant to be an ethnography. So some kind of welcoming to the city. So the idea was to intensify certain qualities that could be manifested as blue color, and at very different scales. So the interventions ranged from collecting all the snow in a single pile rather than in many piles, and created a large pile that would take longer to melt, all the way to changing all the windows, all the glass of all the buildings that face the airport, so that you will see these blue reflections as you approach the city. So yeah, that blue glass that we all hate, that's the one that we wanted to install in the buildings, but facing a single direction. So it was basically a simple exercise about, yeah, basically the landscape as how it is perceived from the road, and how it can be manifested in different colors. In the container deposits, for example, we will keep some containers freeze there, the ones that face the road, and paint them in different shades of blue. So these will be containers that wouldn't move and will become the wall of the container park. These are some detail, well, not really details, some diagrams of the idea of changing some of the glass of the buildings. But really, the document that led this process was the plan. So it's a plan in which different interventions were inserted. This is 17 kilometers. It's a 17-kilometer drive, and as you can see, the drawings are very raw. This is when the team was just me, and so it was not even possible to do 3D. So these are all Bing images with simple Photoshop collage. This is a project that I did very recently with Giancarlo Masanti. I think this is the strangest competition that has happened in Colombia in many years. This is a competition for designing a greenhouse in the tropics. It's a strange idea. It's in Bogota. Bogota is a cold city, of course, but many of the species that you will have on a greenhouse, even in Bogota, you can have in an open air condition for most part of the year, and all you need is some degree of protection, but you don't need really the glass building that is basically a colonial idea. It's an idea that have about basically Northern European, particularly German, Swedish, about basically having a contained paradise. So, and English were very fond of this idea too, which is basically to take tropical plants there and have them exhibit and do whatever architecture it takes to keep them alive. So that competition happened in Bogota, and from that moment we were interested in somehow fighting a little bit this idea that this is an extremely bourgeois concept, this idea of having a building for tropical plants. And in the tropic, that will be even more complicated. But they're also, of course, quite beautiful. And we were also fascinated by them, and just simply acknowledging the fact that these crystal palaces as a type are also extremely interesting. They are halfway between a garden and a palace, and there's some architecture there that we were interested in as well. So as Camilo was showing, this image that is becoming also a kind of a cliche of what we are is instrumental, because in Bogota we're actually quite close to these zones. And we were starting to do studies about the plans that were asked in the brief. We realized that 80% of those plants actually don't need that building. They need some degree of protection, more like a blanket rather than a glass house. And there has been, through history, other techniques to do that. But probably you have seen these tents that you can buy in Northern Europe to cover your Mediterranean tree in the winter. And we were interested in decontextualizing that. Some of them are textile, and using some of the most basic architectural principles of the palaces as a way to construct basically what we thought was a kind of collage of what the history of greenhouses has been. In terms of construction, we were interested also in some of the principles of the more unusual palaces for plants like this one. So completely prefabrication and easy assemblage. But also, again, the work of Bernardes. In this case, I think Giancarlo was more looking into Stan Allen, and I was looking at Bernardes, and maybe just putting this horizontally, these ideas that and that are also easy to connect with some example for Northern Europe, could be useful to understand that some parts of this building can be open, some parts can be closed, and the ones that are closed can also, doesn't necessarily have to be hard, they can be soft. And some of these trees could somehow behave in the same way as the field of the structure behaves. So it's still a competition with a brief. They asked for different rooms, so one for the jungle, one for the desert, one for what they call the utilitarian plant, what Camilo was describing, plants that have a function or that have been determined that have some kind of interest, whether it's ethnographic or simply for food. And so these are the rooms as given by the competition that we decided to organize in this way, not because we wanted a typical courtyard, because we weren't imagining that in a good day in Bogota, which is actually not rare to have 21 degrees Celsius in Bogota, or even 25 in a really good day, you can open up all those curtains and have this fantasy garden for real that you couldn't be able to have in a greenhouse in the north of Europe, which could be to have a horizontal view of all these gardens that were meant to be separated because the brief was based in that kind of thinking. So the drawings were basically meant to show that, talking a little bit about representation and interest in showing the plant as individual and a unit with more or less the same intensity as some of the, let's say, more structural elements or harder elements of the building, as a way to also help dissolve the perception of this piece. And this curtain that at that time we thought was probably PVC, the best way to do it, that could be able to open and close these gardens depending on the temperature outside. And of course, some diagrams and drawings that we were trying to prove it that will actually work. But what I really believe about this project, even if the science of that wouldn't have been possible to refine in the competition process, the tropics, as I think Brigitte was describing quite well, are actually resilient enough so the science doesn't have to be so precise. So in many cases, we have a quite big advantage to landscape projects that are done in the north, in the United States or in Europe, which is that we have a little bit of a margin when we are working with other professionals to determine certain environmental conditions of the building work. Because simply, well, maybe 2 or 3 will die or will not grow as much, but it's not like the main ideas of the building or the landscape will collapse. Thank you.